The air in the cramped workshop was thick with the scent of oil and damp wool. The faint flicker of candlelight casting elongated shadows that danced against the peeling wallpaper. Elias sat hunched over his workbench, the sharp silver blade in his hand trembling ever so slightly as it hovered above the coarse black ribbon that adorned the grief garment sample. Outside, the muffled sounds of Victorian London, horse-drawn carriages rattling over cobblestones, distant shouts, and the ever-present fog swallowing the gas lamps seemed to fade into a tense silence. He breathed in deeply and then, with a surgeon's precision, sliced through the ribbon. The cut was clean, almost imperceptible. No frayed edges, no telltale loose threads. He lifted the severed ribbon and let it fall silently onto the wooden table. His eyes gleamed. This was it, the breakthrough he had sought for months. A method to sever grief garments without detection, a literal cut at the very fabric of enforced sorrow. Martha, who had been quietly watching from the corner, stepped closer, her dark curls catching the candlelight. "You've done it," she whispered, voice trembling with excitement and fear. "No one will know," Elias nodded. "But every step forward invites the shadows to lengthen. The morning police will not ignore this for long." Their underground network had grown steadily, whispers of Elise's skill spreading through the lower classes and even creeping into the circles of the desperate elite. Each altered garment was a small act of rebellion, a secret liberation from the crushing weight of material sorrow. The next morning, Elias met with Mrs. Lysandra Vane, a widow of considerable wealth and influence who had heard of his discreet services. She was draped in her customary mourning silks, the heavy black fabric falling in perfect folds, her throat encircled tightly by the grief ribbon that symbolized her loss. "Mr. Elias," she said, her voice soft but resolute, "I require your skill. To hide my true grief beneath this facade and yet not be strangled by it." Elias bowed his head in understanding. "I have developed a technique," he explained, "to sever the ribbon without leaving any sign. It will feel as though you wear mourning, but the burden will be lifted." Mrs. Vane allowed him to measure and examine her garment, her pale fingers trembling. "If this brings freedom, I am willing to risk the consequences." Meanwhile, Constable Harrow prowled the fog-choked streets with growing suspicion. Reports of altered grief garments were increasing, and his investigations had uncovered subtle inconsistencies, seams that didn't match, ribbons that frayed in unexpected ways. He tightened his coat against the chill, his eyes scanning every mourner he passed. "This defiance will not be tolerated," he muttered, the badge on his chest gleaming coldly beneath the gaslight. Back in the workshop, Elias and Martha worked tirelessly, perfecting the delicate cuts and teaching trusted apprentices the technique. Each successful alteration was a victory, but with every one, the danger grew. The morning police intensified their patrols, and the network whispered of a looming crackdown. One evening, as the city settled into uneasy quiet, Elias sat alone, the weight of his actions pressing down heavier than any fabric. He traced the edge of a freshly severed ribbon, feeling the paradox, liberation born of risk, hope woven through fear. The ribbon's edge was a dangerous place to stand, but Elias knew he could not step back now. The seams of Victorian mourning were unraveling, and he held the scissors. As the chapter closes, the faint clip of boots echoes closer, signaling that the mourning police are closing in. Elias's eyes narrow, resolve hardening. The air in the back room was thick with tension, heavier than the dense fog that clung to the gaslit streets outside. Elias stood at the center, the flickering candlelight casting his gaunt shadow against the peeling wallpaper, the room smelling faintly of damp wool and stale tobacco. Around him, the faces of his apprentices were drawn tight with fear and frustration. Mara's fingers trembled as she clenched a patchwork sleeve, her eyes darting like a startled bird's. "You ask too much," Jonah muttered, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. His voice was low but edged with sharpness. "The risks grow greater every day. We're exposed, Elias, and yet you push us further into the shadows." Lilius's gaze hardened but remained patient. "If we falter now, what have we fought for?" Mara's lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But at what cost? My brother was taken last week. They're closing in." The room fell into a suffocating stillness. Elias felt the sting of her words as if they were needles piercing through his resolve. He knew the dangers were real. Each new alteration, each secret meeting risked discovery by the morning police. Yet the alternative, surrendering to the suffocating rituals of grief, was a fate worse than any jail cell. "We cannot let fear dictate us," Elias said firmly, stepping forward so the candlelight caught the tired lines on his face. "Our cause is larger than any one of us. We must hold fast." But Mara's eyes flashed with something else, desperation or defiance, and she turned abruptly, the wooden floor creaking beneath her hurried steps. Before Elias could call her back, she was gone, swallowed by the night. The betrayal was a wound that cut deep. Elias knew that cracks in their unity could be exploited by Inspector Gray and his relentless agents. The morning police had tightened their noose, and now, more than ever, Elias's leadership would be tested. In the days that followed, whispers of suspicion curled through the group like smoke. Trust frayed as each member wondered who might betray them next. Elias worked tirelessly, patching holes not just in garments but in the fragile bonds holding his circle together. One evening, alone at his workbench, Elias traced the torn seam of a grief garment, the very fabric that symbolized the chains they sought to break. His hands shook, but his eyes burned with renewed determination. "If we cannot trust each other," he murmured, "then all is lost. But I will not let fear unravel us." Not yet. Beyond the hidden rooms and shadowed alleys, Inspector Gray watched with cold calculation. The outlaw tailor's network was weakening, but Elias was not yet caught. The game of cat and mouse intensified, the stakes higher than ever. Elias's world teetered on a knife's edge between hope and despair, loyalty and betrayal. The question remained, could he mend the tattered loyalties before the morning police tore them apart forever? As the fog rolled back over the city, cloaking secrets and sorrows alike, Elias prepared for the next move in a dangerous dance with fate, knowing that the future of their rebellion depended on the threads of trust he could still weave. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall swung open to reveal a scene that might have been lifted from the pages of a tragic play, each guest a player bound by the invisible script of mourning. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars overhead, their multifaceted prisms casting fractured light that danced and shimmered over the sea of black and violet gowns, the rustling silk and stiff collars of men whose faces were hidden behind delicate somber masks. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax candles, mingled with the faintest hint of lavender and the whisper of crushed velvet. It was the annual mourner's mask, a ritual spectacle where grief was not just worn but performed, each gesture and glance weighed down by the ceremonial pressure that gripped Victorian London. Elias moved through the crowd with cautious grace, his every step measured against the polished marble floor that echoed faintly beneath his boots. His own mask, a dark velvet covering edged with subtle silver embroidery, concealed the sharpness of his gaze. Around him, the elite clung to their costumes of sorrow, their mourning garments heavy with layers of silk, crepe, and jet beads, each stitch a testament to loss, yet also a chain binding them to societal expectation. He paused beside a marble fountain that burbled softly, its water catching the light like spilled glass. There, draped in a flowing gown of deep violet, stood Lady Maribel Stanton, her face hidden behind a black lace mask studded with jet beads that caught the candlelight. Her posture was regal, the weight of her sorrow palpable even through the delicate fabric. Elias inclined his head in greeting as she returned the gesture with a faint, knowing smile. "You honor us with your presence, Mr. Elias," she murmured, voice low enough to be lost beneath the swell of music and conversation. Few tailors dare to cross the threshold of such hallowed grief. He returned her smile with a flicker of defiance. "I come not as a mere tailor tonight, Lady Maribel, but as a messenger. There are those among us who long for a freedom beyond this performative sorrow." Her eyes, visible through the filigree of her mask, glimmered with a flicker of hope. "Then let us weave new patterns together." As the orchestra struck up a haunting waltz, Elias blended once more into the swirling crowd. His mind raced with the delicate balance he must maintain. Every word, every gesture, a calculated move in a dance far more dangerous than the one on the floor. Nearby, Captain Hargrave, the stern enforcer of mourning laws, prowled the edges of the ballroom. His black tailcoat bore the silver emblem of the morning police, his mask plain but imposing, eyes sharp and alert. Elias felt the weight of the officer's gaze like a blade, a reminder of the ever-present threat that shadowed his every move. Among the guests, a young debutante named Miss Rosalind Gray caught Elias's eye. She was a fragile figure wrapped in a gown of morning white, her mask edged with delicate black ribbons that contrasted starkly against her pale cheeks, flushed with the heat of the crowded room. Her wide eyes shone with innocent curiosity, a silent question hanging in the air. Could the rigid customs of grief ever bend to the yearning for emotional freedom? Elias approached her with a gentle bow. "The dance is as much a mask as the one upon your face, Miss Gray, but sometimes even masks can slip." She blinked, a faint smile touching her lips, and for a moment, the heavy cloak of mourning seemed to lift. Throughout the evening, Elias wove through the glittering throng, planting quiet seeds of doubt and hope. He spoke in hushed tones to sympathetic ears, shared coded messages hidden in the subtlest of gestures, and observed the cracks beneath the veneer of public grief. Yet, with each step deeper into this world of shadow and sorrow, the danger grew sharper. Captain Hargrave's presence loomed like a storm cloud, and Elias knew that one misstep could unravel everything. As the night waned, the grand clock tower in the square outside chimed the late hour. The masked guests began to disperse, their grief garments rustling like dry leaves in the chill air. Elias lingered, his heart pounding with the thrill of defiance and the weight of the risks ahead. In the dim glow of a side corridor, Lady Maribel found him once more. "The fabric of society is woven with grief," she said softly. "But even the strongest cloth can be unraveled." Elias met her gaze, resolve hardening. "Then let us be the hands that unravel it, stitch by stitch." As he slipped away into the fog-laden streets of London, the masquerade of sorrow faded behind him, but the echoes of the night's whispered promises lingered. The mourner's mask was more than a ball. It was a battleground where the performance of grief met the spark of rebellion. And Elias, the Shadow Tailor, was determined to tear down the gilded cage that bound them all. But beneath the glitter and the masks, the question remained. Could the delicate threads of hope withstand the tightening grip of the morning police, or would the dance end with Elias unmasked and lost to the shadows forever? The night held its breath, waiting for the next move in this dangerous game of loss, love, and liberation. The air in the cellar was thick and close, shadows pooling in the corners next to splintered crates and stacks of folded, heavy mourning cloths. Elias crouched low by the flickering candle, his fingers deftly adjusting a seam on a garment designed to ease the weight of sorrow, without betraying the stern etiquette expected by the upper classes. Around him, his apprentices whispered urgently, their voices barely above the rustling of fabric. The secrets they carried were fragile threads woven beneath the surface of a city suffocated by grief and rigid custom. Tonight, the room's cramped cons were filled with a mixture of hope and dread. The underground network Elias had nurtured was growing, but so too were the eyes watching from the shadows. The morning police, tireless and unforgiving, had stepped up their patrols and investigations. Rumors of arrests and public shaming had begun to circulate, chilling even the bravest hearts. A sudden, sharp clatter shattered the hushed atmosphere. The heavy wooden door to the cellar was flung open with a violent crash. Lantern light spilled into the room, casting stark illumination over faces frozen in shock and fear. Men in black uniforms stamped down the stairs, their boots echoing like thunder upon the worn stone. At their head was Inspector Mallory, his gaze razor-sharp, sweeping over the gathered rebels with chilling precision. By order of the Crown, he barked, voice hard as iron, "This assembly is hereby dissolved. Any resistance will be met with force." Panic erupted. Lydia seized a bundle of garments, clutching them to her chest as others scrambled for hidden exits. Elias's heart hammered fiercely. This raid was no accident, but a calculated strike to dismantle their fragile rebellion. Despite the chaos, Elias moved swiftly, guiding his apprentices toward a narrow passage concealed behind a stack of crates. But it was too late for some. Lydia was seized by two officers, her protests muffled as she was hauled toward the stairs. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, hers wide with fear, his filled with helpless sorrow. The raid was ruthless and effective. Garments were torn, journals containing Elias's coded methods confiscated, and many of his trusted allies were dragged away, their fates uncertain. The weight of betrayal pressed upon Elias's chest, the fraying edges of their cause unraveling before him. Days later, the public spectacle of punishment began. In the town square, mourners caught wearing altered grief garments were paraded before a jeering crowd. Their sorrow was no longer private but a spectacle of shame. Elias watched from afar, the faces of those he cared for marked with humiliation, their dignity stripped alongside the modified fabrics. The movement that had promised liberation now seemed shackled by fear. But beneath the despair, a flicker of resolve burned in Elias's heart. The cost of their defiance was steep, but surrender was not an option. The threads of rebellion might be frayed, but they were not yet broken. As night fell over the gaslit streets, Elias stood alone beneath a wrought iron lamppost, the cold wind tugging at his coat. Somewhere in the distance, the mournful toll of a church bell echoed through the fog. He clenched his fists, knowing that the fight to unbind grief from its gilded cage was far from over. "They may have taken our friends," he whispered to the darkness, "but they will never take our hope." And with that, Elias melted into the shadows, the hunted tailor determined to stitch a new future from the tattered remnants of their cause. The chill of the London evening seeped through the narrow cracks of the chapel's ancient walls. But inside, a warmth kindled by shared conviction spread among the gathered few. Reverend Samuel Whitlock stood at the pulpit, his voice steady yet impassioned, weaving words that seemed to pierce the heavy fog of despair enveloping Victorian society. "We are called not to bear grief as a shackle, but to honor the departed with hearts unburdened by the cruelty of enforced display," he proclaimed, the stained glass windows casting kaleidoscopic hues upon his resolute face. Elias listened intently, his fingers clenched around the worn fabric of his coat. The Reverend's words were a balm to his weary spirit, a beacon cutting through the darkness that had shadowed his every step since he first dared to loosen the seams of sorrow. Here was a man who saw beyond the ritualistic cruelty that bound them all, a man who dared to challenge the divine sanction of grief garments. Outside the chapel, the city pulsed with its usual cacophony, but within the cramped confines of Clara Montague's studio, a different kind of noise erupted. Brushes scraped vigorously against canvas, paint splattered in wild arcs, and the scent of turpentine mingled with the faint trace of candle wax. Clara, her hands a riot of color and motion, was lost in the creation of a mural that dared to depict grief as a prison wrought from thread and fabric. Her eyes, sharp and bright, flicked momentarily to Elias as he entered, a rare smile touching her lips. "This is not just paint," she murmured, gesturing at the anguished faces and tangled chains forming on the wall. "It is a call to break free." Elias nodded, feeling the surge of renewed purpose. The movement that had begun in the shadows of his tiny workshop was now blossoming into a tapestry of resistance woven with voices from unexpected quarters, the clergy who preached mercy, the artists who wielded creativity as defiance. Yet the path was perilous. In the dim back room of a bustling tavern, Elias and Martha Gray huddled close, their whispered words slipping between the clamor of drunken laughter and the scrape of wooden stools. Martha's eyes darted nervously toward the doorway as she passed. Elias a folded piece of paper, a coded message detailing the next steps of their campaign. "The morning police have doubled their patrols," she warned softly, her voice taut with concern. "We must be cautious." "Caution is our ally," Elias replied, his tone steady though his heart raced. "But we cannot let fear unravel everything we've woven." Their conversation was a delicate dance of secrecy and hope, a microcosm of the larger struggle unfolding across London's grimy streets and gilded halls. It was in these moments, amid whispered plans and stolen glances, that the true strength of their cause emerged. The crescendo of their efforts culminated in a clandestine gathering beneath the flicker of candlelight, where clergy, artists, tailors, and mourners convened in a solemn pact. The room hummed with quiet determination as Reverend Whitlock, Clara Montague, Elias, and others laid out strategies to undermine the suffocating grip of grief garment laws. "We must reshape the narrative," Clara urged, "transform grief from a spectacle into a personal journey." And we must show that compassion is not weakness, the Reverend added, but the very fabric of true mourning. Elias's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of those who had risked everything to stand here with him. Despite the looming threat of the mourning police and the weight of centuries of tradition, a fragile hope blossomed, a hope that, perhaps, together, they could weave a new social fabric where grief was honored but no longer imposed. As the meeting dispersed into the London night, Elias lingered a moment longer, the chill now tempered by a fire kindled within. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but the threads of their rebellion were stronger than ever, intertwined with the courage and conviction of those who dared to dream of a future uncloaked in sorrow. The city might still wear its veil of grief, but beneath it, the weaving of hope had begun, quietly, fiercely, irrevocably. And as Elias stepped out into the fog, a whispered question lingered in the air: could the stubborn fabric of Victorian mourning truly be unraveled? The answer would come, stitch by daring stitch, in the days to come. The low hum of the city beyond his workshop window was muffled by the thick fog that clung to the cobblestone streets of London, a persistent shroud that seemed to mirror the heavy weight of grief that draped over the populace like the very garments Elias sought to transform. In the flickering glow of a lone candle, Elias bent over his work table, fingers deftly weaving silver threads into the midnight black fabric that lay before him. This was no ordinary mourning dress. This was the liberation garment of creation born from countless nights of whispered yearning and fierce defiance. Each stitch carried the hope of a future unshackled from the rigid expectations that had long dictated how sorrow must be worn and suffered. Elias's breath caught as he tied off the final seam, stepping back to survey the garment. Its design was both familiar and startlingly new. The customary veils and heavy layers were replaced by flowing fabrics that caught the light, embroidered with patterns of blooming flowers and rising flame symbols of life and resilience. It was a silent rebellion sewn into cloth, a manifesto for mourners who wished to grieve on their own terms. The liberation garment was meant to be a beacon, a challenge to the cruel etiquette that had transformed grief into a public spectacle of oppression. That very evening, in a hidden room beneath the city's labyrinthine streets, Elias gathered his trusted circle. The room was thick with anticipation as Martha, his keen-eyed apprentice, carefully arranged the garment on a mannequin, the silver threads shimmering like stars in the dim light. Lady Arabella Whitcomb, the enigmatic aristocrat who had quietly pledged her support, sat with a measured grace, her gaze fixed on the garment as if seeing beyond its fabric into the promise it held. "It is unlike anything I have ever seen," murmured Martha, her voice a mixture of awe and tentative hope. "It does not weigh the bearer down, but lifts them." Elias nodded, feeling a rare smile touch his lips. Grief need not be a cage, nor a burden to display. It can be a quiet strength, a private flame that guides rather than consumes. This garment is our statement. The room fell into a hush as those assembled contemplated the significance of Elias's words. Whispers floated like fragile threads, weaving through the air, some filled with hope, others with fear. The mourning police had long hunted those who dared to defy the laws, and now Elias's defiance was more visible than ever. Later, as Elias stepped out into the chill of the London night, rain began to fall, cold and relentless. Beneath the gas lamps, a shadow detached itself from the mist Lady Arabella. Her eyes, dark and shining with unshed tears, met his. "You tread a perilous path," she said softly, voice trembling with a blend of fear and admiration. "But perhaps it is one we must walk. I will stand with you, Elias, not as a subject of sorrow, but as a bearer of hope." Their hands clasped briefly, an unspoken vow passing between them. Yet from the shadows, Inspector Hargrave watched, his gaze sharp and unforgiving. The city's machinery of control was shifting into motion, and Elias's act of rebellion would not go unanswered. As the liberation garment began to find its way onto the shoulders of those brave enough to wear it, debates ignited across parlors and alleys alike. To some, it was a betrayal of sacred tradition. To others, a breath of fresh air in a stifling world. The very fabric of Victorian mourning was unraveling, thread by delicate thread. Elias knew the risks that lay ahead. the morning police would come with greater force and the stakes would rise. Yet, in the quiet moments before dawn, as the city held its breath beneath the gray sky, he allowed himself a single thought, a hope that the pattern he had broken might one day be woven anew into a tapestry where grief was a personal journey, not a public shackle. The night deepened, and with it the promise of change flickered like the candlelight, fragile yet unyielding.